Our next speaker will be Susan Omilian. Susan is an attorney, author, and motivational speaker who's advocated for over 40 years to end violence against women. She has worked as a sexual assault victim advocate and also represented domestic violence victims in divorce proceedings. With the death 23 years ago of her 19-year-old niece, Maggie, killed by her ex-boyfriend, Susan's work became more immediate and personal. She vowed to help women move on after abuse as Maggie could not. Susan is now the originator and facilitator of My Avenging Angels workshops, based on the idea that living well is the best revenge. These have helped hundreds of women take the journey from victim to survivor to thriver. She has also facilitated intervention groups with male domestic violence offenders in both Massachusetts and Connecticut, and presented her work on thriving after trauma to female inmates in Pennsylvania and male inmates in Connecticut and Massachusetts.
Thank you, Pearl. It's great to be here. I want to talk today and sort of add another piece to what Pearl was talking about in terms of the impact of trauma on victims and the kind of traumas and the kind of violence that they might experience. I want to talk more about the impact on families, and starting with the impact on my family, which was as a result of my niece, Maggie, who you can see pictured here, who was a beautiful young 19-year-old college sophomore. She's also very athletic, musical. She was one of those kids that was kind of a Renaissance kid and a problem solver. And she was attending a very good school out in the Midwest in Michigan, and had been involved with a student who was a little older than she was. They had a relationship for a number of months that she broke off. She called him immature, and had some experiences with him that she felt he wasn't the kind of person that she wanted to be involved with long term. Next slide. So one of the things, as Pearl mentioned, I now do work with women, helping them move on after abuse, because he not only killed her, but he killed himself. And so in that process of the idea that how do I get revenge as a family, as me personally, particularly with the background that I had working on this issue, I had lots of issues that I thought could have been resolved, that could have saved Maggie, but those were out of my control. What happened to her was out of my control, but I felt I could find some way to help others to move on as Maggie could not. And I found this, when I Googled the word revenge, I found this saying, living well is the best revenge. And I thought that's really what I wanted to do. That's what I wanted my family to do. And I felt that that was the way that I could get back at the situation that had happened to my niece. Next slide. So here's a little more detail about this situation and kind of what was under our control, beside obviously her death and the way she was killed wasn't under our control, but some of the things that I think weren't noticed, some of what the word we use today is the red flags in her situation. This is 1999, this is about 20 years ago. So Maggie was 19 years old, he was 20. She broke up with him, she called him immature. One of the signs that her girlfriends talked about after her death was that she felt he was pushing the relationship too far, too fast. But he had never physically threatened her or assaulted her before he killed her. And for many young women, particularly young women or people in these kind of relationships, the danger becomes clearer when there's physical assaults or physical violence. But there wasn't that in Maggie's case. However, when after her death, I did some speaking at the college where she was killed. And I talked to some of her girlfriends, and when I showed them the warning sign list, the warning signs of a potentially abusive relationship. They're all like, oh my God, this happened too. He was verbally abusive, he was manipulative, he was possessive, he was overly controlling, he wanted to know where she was. And when she did break up with him, he constantly called her, emailed her, texted her or her friends, begging her to return. And this went on for quite some period of time. Maggie didn't perceive that anyone on the college campus would help her through this problem. As I mentioned before, she was a problem solver. She thought she could solve the problem all by herself. And so one night he invited her to come to see him in his dorm room. She had done that before. She used to help him with his school papers. And I think in her mind, knowing my niece, she thought she was going to tell him one more time to leave her alone, and then she was going to leave the room. Next slide. What she didn't know is he had a gun. It wasn't an assault rifle, which is more common these days and more available, but he had a hunting rifle, which was pretty easily obtained in Michigan without, I don't think it was even a 24-hour wait. And the gun store owner knew that he had given a college dormitory address. He knew that he was a college student. The gun store owner had no responsibility legally to contact the school, which would have had reasonable cause to search his room and find the gun, but he did not. The gun shop owner did not feel that obligation legally or morally. His friends also knew that he was suicidal that night. Interesting what Pearl talked about is this sort of inclusion of suicidal thoughts and actions on top of being a victim of crime or of violence, and also now a perpetrator. Although he never hit her, she didn't understand that she was in danger. That moment when you leave a relationship is a very, very volatile moment. It's a very vulnerable moment. It's where that person who you thought would not hurt you might in fact go to that place. So the warning signs were there, the red flags, as we talk about them today. Refusal to accept the breakup of a relationship. He could threaten to kill himself if she left and wouldn't return. And that was, I think, difficult for Maggie to accept, that, you know, her leaving would cause him to kill himself. He was obsessed and possessive of her. And I think his mindset was, if he couldn't have her, no one else could. Next slide. So I'm a survivor of homicide. That means that one of my family, someone close to me, someone I love, has been a homicide victim. And so not only it affects families of homicide victims, and in the recent mass shooting in Texas, Uvalde, Texas, I think you can see that if you've watched any of the coverage of it, that the families have the first impact, let's say. Maybe I wouldn't say the greatest impact, but certainly it's hard to judge impacts, but parents, siblings, aunts, uncles, cousins, grandparents, you could see that in Uvalde because a lot of these families seem to have generations of family living in the area. So grandparents, aunts and uncles, cousins. Then it goes out to friends and coworkers. Many of Maggie's friends were very, very, very upset about this and had a very adverse impact. They were also young. They were in their 90s and 20s and had never had this kind of experience before. Neighbors of my brother and sister-in-law who knew Maggie for years and years, grew up with her, had an impact. Fellow students, teachers, the immediate neighborhood, the surrounding community, and then the larger community. Although Maggie's death, which was about Columbine, happened in the spring of 1999, Maggie was killed in the fall of 1999. Because it wasn't technically a mass shooting, which today is defined as 4 or more people who are killed as a result, because only she and then the perpetrator, although they usually don't count the perpetrator in that number, was not a mass shooting. So we didn't get the national, but in the community where she was killed, people still talk about what happened to my niece and talk about how the school did or didn't respond. So there's a larger community. What the impact of that violence and trauma is: shock and turmoil and guilt, anger, and, as I said before, the need for revenge. And for some people, although they don't understand it initially, post-traumatic stress and depression, And they go through the 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, depression, bargaining, and acceptance. And what I've learned about those 5 stages is they don't go in order. That in fact, you could one day be in acceptance and then something happens and you bring yourself back to anger. I certainly can get triggered back to anger and depression every time there's a school shooting anywhere in this country, which now is pretty frequent. Then, although we didn't have to deal with the police because there wasn't a long-term criminal prosecution of this man who killed himself, but that's something that homicide survivors really have to deal with. And not only homicide survivors, but anyone who's a victim of a crime who reports it. And coming back into the court system is going to bring back all of that and all the trauma. Begin to cope with loss. Holidays are still very hard 20 years later for us. And sometimes people talk to us about, do you ask me, do I forgive this man for doing what he did? And I consider forgiveness the F word. I don't need to go there. I don't mention his name. I don't talk about him except in the context of what happened to Maggie, to have people understand the sort of dynamics. But it's hard because that loss is there. And there was certainly an impact on his family also. But coping with that loss comes back to you at times you don't expect it. And then finally, what's good or bad in your family and your marriage will all come out. The good things about my family were the things that got us through. And then the hard things that triggered people back to some previous traumas were the difficult things. So it's just hard to be on that plane where all this will not affect you. At the same time, you want it to affect you in some way because someone that you loved is not only gone, no longer part of this life, but was killed in such a violent, unexpected way. Next slide. Oh, so you're going to go back, Pearl. I'm sorry, I didn't realize that I did mine. So what I wanted to say about this sort of more broadly in terms of what we're talking about today in preventing violence, one of the things that I've thought a lot about in looking at the kinds of impacts on my family and her friends and the students that are around her is that certainly there should have been more advocacy and awareness on Maggie's campus now 20 years ago about these kinds of red flags, warning signs. Nobody reported him, particularly his own friends who believed and saw that he was suicidal that night, possibly more suicidal than homicidal. More education of students, more education and training on the campus of employees, how to deal with this. And we certainly are seeing that in the Texas shooting, that people are looking at each other and trying to figure out who knew what and how this might have been avoided. And not just in terms of the impact on the person who's the victims, but also the other children that in that school and the trauma of it. Certainly looking at student on policies and student conduct, the way the school deals with people who have tendencies or show red flags for perpetration, and then finally the presence of guns, which since 1999 and Columbine and my niece's murder has become even a bigger and bigger issue. Like I said, Maggie was not killed with an assault weapon, but today that seems to be the assault weapon of choice. There are some federal regulations and laws that impact this, particularly on the college campuses and schools. Title IX does cover discrimination on the basis of sex. My niece was murdered because she was a woman, and she was deprived of her education. That's a violation of Title IX. However, some regulations have been changed recently on Title IX to not include physical forms of abuse and some of the ways that colleges deal with perpetration, which would allow the school to deal with it before it goes to a more serious and final end, which would be what happened to my niece. Today, my family is doing well. We have our moments. I have this work that has inspired me and keeps me going. And I do believe that living well is the best revenge, and that the kind of work that we still need to do on trauma and the impact on trauma is not only important, but crucial for all of us to be able to move through the kind of issues that we face, and sometimes the issues that we're not sure are coming towards us and how we might cope with it and help the people around us to cope. Thank you.